Hi there, and welcome to Tucktuk's Trinkets and Terrain. For those of you new here, my name is David, and for those of you returning, welcome back. In this week's video, I'm going to be showing you how I took a dollar store wooden boat and elevated it into something that I can use for Dungeons & Dragons, or really any tabletop RPG. So, thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoy.
So this is what we're working with, this woodshop pack from the dollar store. There's a couple different ones that come in this set, a car and a plane I believe, but obviously we're working with the boat here. Here's all the pieces that come with it. The sails they feel like dryer sheets, so I'm not going to use those, but we are going to use basically all of this. You can see here this was the original design with the main block supporting one of the horizontal masts, and then the mast itself with the other one, and then the string hooks up to the top, and I guess you just glue the sails down. First thing we're going to do is use our knife and a metal tool to carve in some wood plank texture to give the bottom of the boat a little bit more variety. Once that was all done, I tried to figure out exactly what I wanted to do here as far as mini uses. I figured I could fit 3 minis on this, 1 in the back and then 2 on the front, but if I had used the horizontal supports as intended, they would not fit. So I ended up grabbing a barbecue skewer to use as one single support. The hole in the mast was not large enough, so I just grabbed a little drill bit. Made the hole a bit bigger to fit the barbecue skewer all the way through. This barbecue skewer was also a lot thicker than the original ones, so it's going to be more stable, less prone to breaking. Here I thought the sail would have been a little too low, so I grabbed a piece of foam board to raise the mast a little bit. Here I just completely forgot that super glue is going to melt through the foam, so that ended up not working, but we go ahead and fix that later. I did use super glue for the sort of end piece on the boat here. After that, I grabbed the original string that came with and eyeballed how big I wanted the sails to be. Just tied that off to the barbecue skewer and then just use the white glue that came with the set to secure it. Make sure that's not going to come undone later. Also glued the top here just again to secure everything, make sure it's not going to move. Here's where I realized that I made a mistake with the glue, and then just use the PVA glue to re-glue that down. While I waited for that, I marked out where I wanted to start a railing for the boat. I cut up a bunch of matchsticks and used some sanding paper here to flatten the edges to make sure they would be straight up and down once they were glued to the boat. And then I just used some white glue to secure them all down. I then glued the mast support to the middle here with the mini to make sure my spacing was right. Here's where we're at so far with the frame of everything basically. Next I started to work on the sails. Just used a little bit of paper towel with a marker to mark where I needed to cut, and then just used those same marks to cut a second one for the other side. Once those were all cut out, I used some full strength glue to glue the paper towel not only to the string, but I also used it to glue the corners just to make sure that those bonds were the strongest, as they were going to be the weakest points. Didn't want them to tear or anything. And then I just saturated the paper towel with a 50-50 mixture of PVA glue and water. These paper towels are non-patterned. They're just sort of a weird swirly design that I didn't mind being on the sails. Figured it would give us some visual interest. After I set that aside to dry, I started to work on the rudder that I wanted to make. So here are the pieces: matchstick, a little metal ring, and then a wooden disc. I measured out the vertical piece of the rudder that would be going into the water and just cut it with my X-Acto blade. And then after failing to cut the wooden disc with my X-Acto blade, I just ended up snapping it in half. This wood's pretty cheap and brittle, so I then clipped that piece in about half to give me a small little rudder section. Now obviously if this was a real boat, most of the rudder, if not all of the rudder, would be underwater, but I still wanted the representation there, as if the rudder was actually below the boat, it wouldn't sit flat on the table. I glued the vertical piece to the little rudder piece here with some white glue. And then for the top pieces, I cut the little metal ring in half. So this was going to hold the rudder sort of in place for whoever's controlling it. And then cut another piece of the matchstick for the horizontal section of the rudder. And since this is multiple materials, I just opted for some super glue here for the rudder piece as well as the ring to hold everything in place. I really hate getting super glue on my fingers, so I grabbed these little pliers here to position the metal ring. Just use them to make sure that the ring dried straight up and down rather than leaning back like it was here. And then cut off another little piece of the matchstick to make a small handle for whoever is back here manning the boat. And then, again, just using some super glue to glue that piece down. And here's a close-up of kind of what's going on. You can see the ring sort of contains the rudder. And then for the last part here, I just used some of the PVA glue to glue this last part. And we're all done. Now while that dried, I set about finishing up the sail. You can see that where the paper towel was folded over, there's a little bit of an overhang on both sides. So I just grabbed a pair of scissors and trimmed off the excess to clean it up a little, make it a little nicer looking. And then I grabbed some thread and needle. This is just some normal tan thread, nothing special. And then my idea here was that the sail needed some way to secure to the horizontal piece of the mast. And I figured that I could just sew some sort of rigging to the bottom of the sail here. I realize this isn't super realistic, but it does end up looking pretty neat in my mind, so I'm pretty happy with it. The paper towel ended up being a lot more sturdy than I anticipated, so this was pretty difficult to sew the thread through the sail itself, but I think the effort was worth it with the final look that I got. And then to secure both ends, I didn't want to tie any knots on the ends because I didn't want sort of a knob there that that knot would form. So I just used some tacky glue and then just wrapped the excess string around the end here, which gives it a nice little visual interest and then obviously secures the string as well. And you did the same thing around the mast for the other end. And then did the same thing for the other side, sewed up the whole bottom, and then I also wrapped a little bit of the thread around the top of the mast to give everything sort of a matching look with the thread. Here it is all done. You can see I also added some glue to where the string meets the sail, just to make sure everything is going to stay where it is and not move around. After that, I went ahead and started painting. I wasn't sure how long this would dry, re-wetting the glue, so I did this before moving on to anything else with the boat. I used a tan and a dark brown that was pretty heavily watered down and just mixed them together to make a dirty, grungy looking sail, maybe one that hasn't been replaced in a long time or is being used in a less than preferred environment. I also use this opportunity to sort of shape the sails to give them a blown out look like the wind is pushing them. So while that dried, I moved back to the railing here. I'm going to use these little metal rings to provide some hooks for the rail to go through. Just separated the ends with some pliers here, and then fit those over each of the posts to provide the rings. I just used some super glue to secure these, with it being metal to wood. And here are those all done up. I haven't done the last two yet on the end, but I do get those eventually. Same method, just separate the rings a little bit, use a little bit of the super glue. For the railing itself, I opted to use this cotton string that I had bought for a previous project so that it could be used for something. I did have some chain that I thought about using, but it was a little too heavy and a little too stiff to use in this particular situation. But for the string, I just tied off one end on my ring here, cut it to length so that I just had a little bit to work with instead of having to deal with this whole roll of string here. And then proceeded to just weave it through the rings. I did do sort of over, under to give it a little bit more interest. Once this was all tied down, I did soak it with some of the 50/50 water and glue to secure it, make sure it wasn't going to go anywhere. I was also very careful not to pull anything taut while it was hooked around something else. These posted rings are relatively fragile, and I knew that with enough pressure one would just pop right off and cause me some trouble. So here we are, all finished up with our railing. After that was all done, it was time to paint. For the wood, I used a base coat of a super dark brown. Covered all of the wood on both the boat and the mast in this dark brown. The wood here is pretty cheap and porous, so it soaked it up pretty quickly and was dry relatively fast as well. After that, I did a dry brush on the wood with a tan. For those of you who don't know, a dry brush is where you load up your brush with paint and then rub most of it off on a paper towel or something so that there's just a little bit left on the brush, and then you just take what's left and sort of gently brush it on whatever surface you want. This is intended to pick out the higher surfaces, whatever you're painting, to give it some highlights and whatnot. This wood is pretty flat, so the dry brushing wasn't super effective, but it did add some nice color variety to the wood on both the boat and the mast. After that was all done, I took a pure white and did another dry brush on the sails to give them a little bit more pop, give it a little bit more of a distinct look from the boat itself. After that, I grabbed my homemade black wash and used it to color up the railing of the string so that it wasn't just a pure white, and then I also used it to wash the wood itself to bring out that wood texture on the base of the boat that we did earlier. And then I used a bright white to highlight the edges and do another dry brush. I was unintentionally a little heavy-handed with this. I think it still came out pretty good. I used my finger to sort of rub off the excess and to make it look like maybe some wood was replaced over time, something like that. Now, with everything all painted, I realized this was very monotone with just browns and tans, so I wanted to add a little bit of a color pop. So what I ended up doing is cutting a piece of flashcard and gluing it to the top of the mast here to form a flag. While the glue was still wet, I used my fingers to just shape the flag into sort of a, as if the wind is blowing it and moving it around. Then I painted that up super bright purple, and here it is all done. I think it turned out really well. I did not glue the sail to the boat itself so that it can be used without the sail for both ease of play and to make it a different boat entirely. I also did make a second type here that was more of a prototype with some different techniques and ideas that I had. Obviously I didn't finish it, but just another idea that you can use if you want. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, hit that like button. If you want to see more of these videos, please subscribe. I do videos every other week, posting on Fridays. I do have an Instagram account if you want to check that out. The link for that will be in the description. I post work in progress videos, other projects that I'm not necessarily doing videos on, things like that. But more than anything, I really appreciate you stopping by and checking this out. I hope to see you next time.